right, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and call to order the regular meeting of the City of Murfreesboro Board of Zoning Appeals for Wednesday, July 29th, 2009. First item on the agenda is the consideration of minutes for the regular meeting on June 24, 2009. Are there any changes to those minutes? If not, then those minutes will stand approved as presented. We'll move next to new business. First is a variance request, application Z09045 by Mr. and Mrs. Mike and Janine Martin, requesting a 7-foot variance of the minimum required 12.5-foot side setback for principal structures in a residential single-family RS-15 zone. And this is for property located at 2251 Tedder Boulevard. Mr. Blomley, if you would review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, and good afternoon, Chairman Rogers and members of the board. As you mentioned, our first item is located at 2251 Tedder Boulevard. And I'll show you the aerial photograph now on the overhead. This is the subject property in 2007. I've got an aerial photograph from Easter Sunday in a moment. The applicant had severe tornado damage in the Good Friday tornadoes, and the house is currently unoccupied pending resolution of insurance. And before he moves forward with finalizing his insurance claim and moving forward with the improvements to his house, he is seeking a variance for an actual addition to the footprint of his house. As I mentioned, here is the house in 2007. And there's the same house in 2009, just a few months ago. It's in the Stones River Park Subdivision, which is located just to the south of Haynes Drive, Tedder Boulevard, just to the south of Haynes Drive. I'll show you some more photographs of the existing property. This is the front of the house right now. Another shot of the front of the house. The addition that the applicant is seeking to build is on the north side of the house. And you can see in this photograph where this pod is right here, and the north side of his house where the existing garage is. The proposed addition would extend out close to this northern property line where there's an existing single-family dwelling adjacent to the north. This is just a look at that his neighbor to the north. This is the north side of Mr. Martin's house. As I'll describe to you in a moment, he's looking to actually convert this existing attached garage into a master bedroom and bathroom. And he would like to build an addition on the side of that because converting the existing garage will leave him with no garage space, so he would like to build a garage adjacent to where the existing garage is now. Just another view there of the driveway where the addition would be constructed. That's a view of the northern property line, that's the house that would be close to the proposed addition. And just looking from the opposite direction back toward Tedder Boulevard. The applicant has had a plot plan drawn up, and A, B, and C are all the existing components of his house right now. C being the garage that he wants to convert to a master bedroom and bathroom, and then D being the new garage. Right now the garage is a side entry garage. The new garage, because of space limitations, would actually be a front entry garage and built, as I mentioned, directly adjacent to the existing garage. The applicant's addition would be, according to this plot plan 6 feet off of the northern side property line. There's a 12.5-foot required side setback variance, or excuse me, 12.5 required side setback. So in order to be 6 feet off of the side property line, the applicant will need a variance. And he has, as I mentioned in my staff comments, he has not tried to make a case for meeting the standards and proof required for variances. And having been made aware of those variants or of those standards, he has still decided to move forward in requesting a variance for the addition to his house. We've gone ahead and advertised it as a 7-foot variance to give him a little bit of leeway if he's granted the variance, so that in case it is over by a half a foot, he would not need to come back before the Board of Zoning Appeals. His primary reason for the conversion of the existing garage into a master bedroom and bathroom suite are to have a master bedroom and bath on the first floor of the house, so that as he and his wife age, that they will not have to climb stairs to get to their bedroom, and in case they might have elderly relatives come stay or live with them, they wanted some place to accommodate them as well. They have been made aware that they cannot construct or install a second kitchen in the house, as that would constitute an accessory apartment, and the applicant has acknowledged that he does not intend to construct a kitchen. If the board approves this application, staff recommends the following condition. A surveyor will be required to help lay out the footing of the building, and a surveyor's certification must be provided that the building addition is no closer than, and I'm going to change this from 6 feet to 5.5 feet as my recommendation to be consistent with the way we've advertised this, from the north side property line. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions that the board may have, and Mr. Martin is here if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, I have one, just as a point of reference. Looking at this picture, would the actual structure be any closer to the next house than what this driveway is?
It looks like it would probably be about even with where that driveway is, if I had to guess, based on the plot plan.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Is there room I understand the need for the addition to carry it out, but is there a way that it can be effected without going into the setback? And what I'm specifically thinking about is maybe carry it off the back of the house. Is there room to carry it off the back of the house without getting into a setback?
I think that the applicant is seeking the size addition that he is proposing, so that he can have a two-car garage, I believe. In order to get a car around the side of the building, or in order to be able to access the rear of the house, he would need to eliminate room and make it a one-car garage instead of a two-car garage, in order to have the driveway go around the house to be a rear access. So I think that's the limiting factor as far as that goes.
The lot itself is square?
That's correct. Perfect rectangle, I believe.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, Mr. Martin, are you present? Anything you'd like to add to this application? I'm sorry, if you would, come to the podium and state your name and address for us.
My name is Mike Martin, 2251 Tedder Boulevard, Murfreesboro 37129. And the garage, as you pull in there from that driveway, the end of the driveway for Mr. Dodd, is actually about 2 feet off that edge of that driveway. And so it's not quite on the edge where the driveway is. And but it would be easier accessible just for us to drive the car straight in. But we'd like to have a two-car garage. That's what we currently have. So.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Martin. Any questions for Mr. Martin? Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward to the podium, state your name and your address, and any comments that you might have. All right, and seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or a motion.
I was curious whether the house that's next door, do they know what's going on? Have we heard from them? They seem to be one of the most greatly affected by it.
I know we sent notices out to the property owners that were adjacent to this property, whether, what the status of them having received the letter with, I'm assuming that house is still currently unoccupied, and Mr. Martin is acknowledging that that is the case. Whether or not it was forwarded to wherever they are at now, I'm not entirely sure. I think that Mr. Martin has talked to that neighbor, though, and he told me that he was going to have a letter from them, but I've never received that. Do you have that, Mr. Martin, or?
Yes, I have received that letter, but I didn't bring that.
Okay. If you wouldn't mind going back to the podium.
Paul and his wife, who are next door, they're on the right side of our house, are good friends of ours, and they had given me a letter. They had to come back here and get a variance as well because they extended their garage over, and so they had given me the letter that it was A-OK, so we've already discussed that and had talked that, but unfortunately, I apologize. I had gotten in from out of town yesterday and just failed to grab that letter, but that's something I can provide if that's requested.
Just curious whether they knew about it and were okay with it. Like I said, they
Yes, sir.
seem
They're
to be
okay with
most
it.
impacted.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve the 7-foot variance with the recommendations of the staff.
Motion, is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? I will say this, Mr. Martin, I'm going to vote against this one, and I feel compelled to explain to you why. On cases like this, the applicant has to satisfy certain criteria, and you haven't offered any evidence in your letter. I mean, you admit that you don't have any evidence to satisfy any of these criteria. I will be candid in saying that on some of these cases that come to us, the evidence is maybe sketchy or light, but I don't think I've ever had one where there's not any. And so for that reason, I don't think that I could in good conscience vote for this. And also, I do believe that there's other ways to skin this cat without encroaching so close to your neighbor. I'm really familiar with this area, and these houses are not that. I mean, they're reasonably close together, but they're not within 6, 7, 8 feet of each other. And I think that would be. I actually think that would be inconsistent with the surrounding property. I think that there are ways that you can tackle this issue better without encroaching so closely on your neighbor, and including extending maybe off the back or reworking the footprint somehow, or simply moving. I feel very sympathetic to your situation given the tornado damage that you've had, but I also feel like I'm compelled to follow what the City Council has directed us to do in the way of guidelines for hearing these kind of matters. So that having been said, any other comments?
Chairman, if I may, I would echo what you have said on this. Of course, if there's no one to object, then there would not be a challenge. If someone did, I would have to question whether this variance, whether there is statutory and ordinance authority to grant this variance. And I recognize, as you said, Mr. Chairman, that sometimes the evidence of practical difficulties, unusual characteristics, narrowness, shallowness, things of that nature, sometimes that proof is rather thin, but I have not yet seen one where there was at least no, where there was no offering of any kind, that was an issue. I certainly see the desirability of this layout from the homeowner's standpoint, yet I think we're also here to protect the setbacks, the spacings between properties. There's no unanimous agreement about what that spacing ought to be, but it's a consistency issue. It's also a safety issue of dwellings being too close together. And the reality is that in this area, our zoning ordinance specifies a setback amount. And it does appear that this is not a tiny lot where there are no options. And while they may not be as desirable with the attempt to, or with the intent to put a larger structure on this lot than was really designed for the lot, I would question whether the neighborhood and the zoning ordinance should bear the brunt of that, as opposed to the homeowners figuring out a way to do it. It does appear that there are options, as you said. And so, yeah, I would add those thoughts, and I guess I would caution the board that it's questionable whether variances should be granted when there is really nothing here in this record that could support a finding of any of the matters that are supposed to be shown in order to approve a variance.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ives. Any other questions or comments?
I guess in that case, I'll just reverse my motion. I just felt like it was okay with the neighbor, it was okay with me, but sorry about that.
It has been, your motion has been seconded. I think, Mr. Dodd, were you the second on that motion?
I was the second. I only say this. I mean, this board all the time gives forgiveness for people who create their own problems, and now this man's come here ahead of time and asking us for a break on the front end. I understand the arguments that are being made, and the record, when staff comes out and says there's nothing in here to support it, it just seems to me that we've given relief on other situations at times where there was no proof of a hardship that existed, and actually even created by property owners themselves on setbacks. And as Mr. Ives pointed out, we really only have one aggrieved party here who apparently is in agreement with it. So that was the reason for my second, but based on Ms. Mosby's request to remove her motion, I'll back my second out.
Okay. Then there is no pending motion on the floor. Mr. Martin, the public hearing is closed, but given the situation, I'll go ahead and, do you have some comments, further comment that you want to make?
Sure. The house where we're living at, the house that we were living at before it got destroyed, we didn't bring that on ourselves, okay? But while we're there, we have the opportunity to stay in that area. We want to stay in that area. We like our house. We like the neighborhood. We've developed lots of friends and all that stuff. We're thinking in the future of being there for a long time, and it's not like we want to move out of the area. And so to accommodate some things that we see in the future, we were just trying to make some things feasible for us. And I had spoke to my neighbor who's to the right of us, because we knew that we were going to be moving in on some of that variance there. And again, they didn't have an issue with it. So the option of us, moving to a different neighborhood or moving out of the area is not something that we would want to consider, because, my son's in school there at Siegel. We've already been there 5 years there at the house, and we plan on retiring there. We just want to make sure that in the future, not having to go up and down the stairs, that we have something that's convenient that's there for us. And having two cars, just because we've been hammered 3 years in a row with hail damage, we would like to make sure that we can pull our cars into the garage and not have to deal with issues with having to replace a car with hail damage. And there's a in the back, I don't know if you can see that, where that pot is, that is a concrete pad. That was a storage shed that has our lawnmower, weed eaters, tiller, things like that. And that would have to be absolutely bulldozed up and moved for us to back that garage out there. And so if that wasn't there, then yeah, it would probably be feasible to make the garage go towards the back, which would take part of our backyard up. But we could do that. But we didn't want to have that tore up and replaced because we expect to replace the shed that's there. So, okay?
Okay. Thank you very much. All right, then we need to get a motion on the floor then.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we deny the special use permit, given the fact that it's difficulty in meeting the standards in order to grant it.
I'll second it.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
The motion passes. Mr. Martin, that application has been denied. All right, we will move on to special use permit height variance request, application Z09046 by Mr. Philip Head of Waller, Lansden, Dorch, and Davis for Verizon Wireless Tennessee Partnership, requesting a special use permit in order to construct a telephone transmission tower in a commercial highway zone for property located at 915 Bridge Avenue, along the south side of Bridge Avenue, west of Malloy Lane. The applicant is also requesting a 45-foot variance of the 75-foot maximum permitted building height in a commercial highway zone in order to allow a 120-foot tall structure. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The property is located at 915 Bridge Avenue. There's actually not a structure that corresponds with that address. It's just a vacant lot. You'll see here, directly to the rear of the subject property is the Stones River. A little bit to the west of the subject property is an animal shelter operated by Ms. Jaycott. And further to the west and to the north is the Hobby Lobby and the House of Carpet and some other commercial highway-type uses. To the east and to the north are some single-family residential uses and some, I believe, some duplexes as well along Bridge Avenue to the east as you head towards Salem Highway. The applicant is making two requests, and after the public hearing and after the discussion, each of those requests will need to be taken in a separate motion. The first request is to construct a special use permit to construct a telephone transmission tower, or a cell tower as it's more commonly known. The applicant does have a pending lease with the property owners, Tom and Brenda Davis, the owners of the subject property. You'll recall back in April of 2008, the applicants were on the Board of Zoning Appeals agenda for the same special use permit request. They withdrew that request because it was determined by staff that there had been some improper fill on the subject property. That improper fill has been remediated, and as that improper fill has been remediated, they are allowed to come back before the Board of Zoning Appeals and request their special use permit. You'll find in front of you a 11 by 17 set of plans from Mr. Head and his engineer, showing the layout of the proposed site as well as an elevation of the tower. As a bit of background with regards to airspace, have been in contact with Mr. Chad Gerke, the airport manager for the city. Mr. Gerke has indicated that the height of this tower and its location in proximity to the airport does not require the form that the FAA requires to be filed. That it is this will have no negative impact on the airspace in the city. And Mr. Gerke actually issued that opinion when the tower was proposed to be 160 feet last year, and now it's proposed to be 120 feet. You'll see here's the design of the proposed facility. Here's a small drive that comes off of Bridge Avenue. There's currently a gate there now that would be paved up until the fenced area of the compound. You'll see that the floodway of the Stones River actually runs through the site, like so, where that dotted line is. And this is page C2 if you want to follow along in the set of plans. The equipment shelter, which would consist of an equipment shelter and a generator shelter, would actually be to the west of the tower. The tower would be here, approximately 75 feet from the Bridge Avenue right-of-way. The tower's fall zone radius, according to a letter provided by an engineer hired by the applicant, is approximately 50 feet. And that 50-foot fall radius would be entirely contained within the bounds of the subject property, and the fall radius would not affect the public right-of-way of Bridge Avenue, nor any adjacent property owners. The applicant is making a request for up to 4 carriers on the proposed cell tower. You can see on page C3 there's an elevation. The applicant is proposing a monopole tower with boom-mounted antenna, and kind of in kind of more common terminology, those are called crow's nest antennas. The boom-mounted antenna protrude farther out from the pole itself than what we've seen in the recent past as flush-mounted antenna. Of course, a stealth tower is where the antenna are actually mounted on the inside of the pole. Staff has made a recommendation that the height variance not be approved unless the applicant agrees to do a flush-mounted antenna. And the reason for that is because with this being a very high-traffic area, very visible area, especially considering the proximity to Bridge Avenue, a street that the city just spent substantial time and effort and money in reconstructing to accommodate the increased amount of traffic. We feel that it's important that we keep the aesthetics of this area in mind when we're looking at this tower, and that the boom-mounted antenna are not appropriate. But we recommend that the applicant commit to the flush-mounted antenna so that the tower is less intrusive. Now, the applicant is proposing a Type C buffer with his landscape plan. And the Urban Environmental Department has looked over the landscape plan and has said that this definitely qualifies as a Type C buffer because in addition to the double-spaced or the 2 rows of trees that will be proposed on site, there will be an 8-foot tall white vinyl privacy fence, much like the fence that we see at the Family Worship Center on Sulphur Springs Road that was approved by the Board of Zoning Appeals a year or so ago. Now, one of the neighbors brought up the issue of whether or not the soil was suitable for the planting of this buffer. So our Urban Environmental Department actually went out to the site this morning, looked at the soil, dug up some samples, and found that much as was expected, the soil on site contains the spoils from other sites. You can tell it's a fill lot, and it's a multitude of different types of soils: clays, a large number of rocks, and even some chunks of asphalt in there. So it's not very conducive, according to our Urban Environmental Department, for the planting of a buffer and for the sustainability of that buffer. So one of the things that, if the board approves this request, with the Type C buffer that the applicants have volunteered, in order to install that Type C buffer, there would need to be some type of remediation plan for that soil, a remediation plan that would be consistent with the plan that was put in place to mitigate the improper fill in the floodway, and that would provide enough enough topsoil in order to sustain that buffer. Because as we've seen in recent months, many times with cell towers, the maintenance of these buffers is something that does come into question because it is such an unmanned site that lots of times the maintenance of the buffers falls by the wayside. It's something that we want to make sure that we hold the applicants to, and we want to make sure that they prepare a site that will sustain the buffer that they are proposing. And just to show you some pictures of the site. This is actually directly across the street. This is looking across the street and back up towards Red Lobster and Hobby Lobby. This is looking towards the rear of the site where they've done some of the cut to mitigate the improper fill in the floodway. Once again, looking at the rear of the site. You can see the slope right there from the rear of the site up towards the pad where the tower would be constructed. This is looking back up west on Bridge Avenue. That's the animal shelter just to the west, behind those trees. And I'll just show you a few photographs of the entrance right there and the flat pad where the proposed tower and equipment shelter would be located. Another photograph of the pad taken from Bridge Avenue.
This was the most well-photographed site I think we've ever had.
I try to be thorough. With that being said, one of the things that we want to emphasize is that in the development of this site, the applicant will need to remember to, the plans will be scrutinized for compliance with our floodplain management ordinance, being that this site is a very sensitive site, and we've spent the better part of a year making sure that it is compliant and that those issues have been mitigated, and that there's no additional fill placed in the floodway. As I mentioned, this tower is actually 110 feet tall. 120 foot tall comes in where you have a 10-foot lightning rod on top of the tower itself. With respect to the additional standards for cell towers, as I mentioned, Mr. Gerke has said that the Murfreesboro Airport has no problem with the proposed tower. The tower is not proposed to be lit. The applicant states in his letter that he is open to discussing the painting of the tower with the BZA, but prefers a galvanized steel finish. And as I mentioned, that the fall radius will be 50 feet, and that will all be contained upon the subject property. The plans have been revised and are in good order. Both the special use permit and the height variance, as I mentioned, should be taken in separate motions. If the board approves the special use permit request, staff recommends the following conditions. The subject development must receive site plan approval from the Planning Commission or administrative site plan approval by the planning and engineering staff if deemed appropriate by the planning director. The landscape plan will be subject to the final review and approval of the city horticulturist. And as the applicant has committed to a type C buffer, that final landscape plan and the implementation of that landscape plan would have to meet Ms. Holloway's expectations for the sustainability of that landscape buffer. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Mr. Head is here as well, and so is his team, and I believe he would like to come up to the podium and say a few words and introduce his team as well.
I'm sorry, Mr. Blomley. On the conditions, You mentioned earlier about the fact that the design would be flush-mounted.
Right. What they are requesting, they are requesting the
boom.
boom-mounted antenna,
Right.
and we as staff are recommending that the height variance part of their request not be approved unless they commit to the flush-mounted antenna. That's our recommendation. Now, the board has the option.
Oh, that just wasn't in your conditions.
Right. That's
Okay.
just our recommendation, and that is at your discretion.
Okay.
And I would like to mention also, and I'll provide a copy of this to Mr. Head, this morning, the neighbor to the west, Ms. Jaycott, dropped off a letter and some photographs, and I've placed that at your desks, and I'll give a copy of that to Mr. Head right now.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right. Mr. Head, is there anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Philip Head. I'm an attorney with Waller Lansden, Dorchin Davis in Nashville, Tennessee. With me today, I have Mr. Alex Wagner, who is a radio frequency engineer for Verizon Wireless. Mr. Wagner is here today to answer any questions that the board may have regarding the radio frequency need for a boom-mounted antenna as opposed to a flush-mounted antenna. As Mr. Blomley has stated, applicant proposes to erect a 120-foot monopole wireless communications facility at 915 Bridge Avenue on property that is currently zoned commercial highway. Applicant would at this time like to submit for the record a written brief detailing the applicant's technical requirement, or excuse me, technical or fulfillment with the technical requirements set forth for both the granting of the height variance as well as the special use permit set forth in your ordinance. At this point, I'll briefly summarize that. Applicant.
Mr. Head, do you have additional copies of this?
I don't. I have possibly one extra. I do have one extra, if you'd like it to be for the board. It mirrors what was in our written submittal letter.
In the original submittal?
That's correct.
Okay.
In the original submittal letter. The bulk variance standards are set forth in Section 10E2 of your ordinance. The hardship imposed on the applicant by the 75-foot height limitation was not created by the applicant, and limiting the height of the proposed tower to 75 feet would prevent other carriers from sharing space on the tower and almost certainly result in more towers being built in the area in the vicinity of the site. The proposed tower will not be unduly detrimental to other properties in the area, and the site will be an asset to adjacent properties because it provides enhanced wireless telecommunication coverages to the area. For that reason, the applicant believes it's fulfilled all the standards set forth in the ordinance for a height variance. Applicant also fully complies with the general standards for the issuance of a special use permit, which are set forth in Section 9 of the ordinance. The proposed tower will not adversely affect adjacent properties or the character of the neighborhood. Rather, the site will be an asset to the area as it will provide enhanced wireless communication coverages. The tower will not affect traffic, parking, or utilities in any manner as it's unmanned, and utilities currently exist along Bridge Avenue that the tower can tie into. In sum, applicant believes that the tower will increase the health, safety, and general welfare of the community by facilitating wireless communication services to the city of Murfreesboro. The proposed tower will be constructed and operated in such a manner as to be compatible with all properties in the immediate vicinity. It will not increase congestion as it is only visited approximately once per month by a service technician, and it will not produce any noise, offensive odors, or be a safety hazards to citizens and properties surrounding it. The wireless facility will also not require any new or additional public facilities or services, and it will not result in the destruction, loss, or damage of any natural, scenic, or historic feature in the area, as it will be constructed on raw land that is currently unimproved. In addition to the standards of general applicability for the issuance of a special use permit, the applicant fully complies with the ordinance's standards for telegraph transmission towers. As Mr. Blomley has stated, and as evidenced by a letter from Mr. Gerke, the site is not located within the approach or landing zone of an airport or heliport. The site fully complies with all governmental regulations, including the FAA and the FCC, and we've submitted evidence of such compliance to the board. The proposed tower will comply with all of the applicable setbacks. The center line of the tower is 75 feet from the nearest property line, and it's situated beyond the 72-foot front setback line along Bridge Avenue. We'd like the board to note also, as stated in the engineering letter that has been submitted to the board, the tower will be constructed in such a manner that in the unlikely event of failure, it will fall within a radius of 50 feet from the base of the tower. As Mr. Baumley stated, the tower will not be lighted, hence the lighting requirements are not applicable. I'd like the board to note that since the tower is so low, it is not required to be lighted by FAA regulations, and the applicant does not propose to do so. The applicant will defer to the board as far as the painting of the tower. We would respectfully request that the board allow a galvanized steel finish for the tower, as it has been the applicant's experience that such a finish blends into the horizon better than other paint schemes. With that, the applicant believes it is fully complied with all of the technical requirements of your ordinance for a special use permit and for a height variance. At this point, I would briefly like to discuss the flush mount versus boom mount issue that has been raised, and I would like to preface that the applicant will comply with the board's wishes. However, we would merely like to note two things. One, the radio frequency need for a boom-mounted design, and second, the public policy consequences of forcing the tower to be flush-mounted. In regards to the first issue, which is radio frequency need for a boom-mounted design, a flush-mounted antennas requires you to basically place 3 antennas into one antenna, and in layman's terms, that compromises the radio frequency coverage that the tower can provide. We have provided to you a detailed letter of the engineering basis behind that, and we have a radio frequency engineer here to answer any of the board's questions regarding that. But to put it in layman's terms, flush mounts compromise the coverage that the existing tower provides. On to a public policy perspective as to why a boom mount might be preferable to the board as opposed to a flush mount is the fact that you cannot have as many carriers share the use of a tower that utilizes flush mounts. Consequently, it is highly likely, if not an almost certainty, that if flush mounts are required to be placed on this tower, you will have other carriers coming before you asking to erect new towers in the vicinity of this tower because there's no space left for co-location on this tower. And the reason that is the case is with a flush-mounted design, and I have a picture here with me to depict, if we could get it up on the screen, and I also have pictures for the board. This is a typical flush mount installation, and if you'll see, you have 3 towers around each center line or each tower height. With a boom mounted design, at each center line or each place where you see antennas, the panels that you see coming from this tower are each what is referred to in the industry as a center line, which is nothing more than a mounting height on the tower. With a boom-mounted design, you have on a platform that protrudes approximately 3 to 5 feet from the base of the tower, a triangle is mounted. And on that triangle, you can have 3 antennas on each face. Here you can see there's only 1 antenna on each face. So at each center line, you are only able to have 3 antennas with a flush mount design as opposed to 9 antennas with a boom mount design. And that affects how many carriers can utilize a site. All of the current carriers own multiple licenses from the FCC, and these licenses are issued for radio frequencies, and basically each technology uses a separate radio frequency, and each distinct radio frequency requires different antennas. So with a flush mount design, what you have the effect of is, in this case with Verizon Wireless, it would take up a minimum of 2 center lines and quite possibly 3 center lines. And those are the spaces that are currently reserved for other carriers to share the use of the tower. So the most likely probability is, if this board chooses to impose a flush mount design, rather than Verizon Wireless being able to share space with 3 additional carriers on this tower, it would be limited to sharing space with only 1 other carrier. And it is quite possible that that one other carrier would not want to co-locate on this tower because Verizon would take up 3 center lines, 3 of the 4 available in the proposed tower. So to try to summarize all that I've just said, if flush mounts are used, 9 Verizon antennas would be placed in the 3 spaces, 3 of the 4 spaces that are available for co-location. There would only be 1 space left for another carrier to come on the site and place 3 antennas. We wanted to make the board aware of that because it is a policy decision and it affects your community. Tower proliferation does. With that said, the applicant will defer to the board's wishes regarding a flush mount design. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions the board may have and yield the floor to Verizon's radio frequency engineer if I'm incapable of answering them.
All right, thank you, Mr. Head. Any questions for Mr. Head?
I have one, Mr. Head. Since I don't know much at all about towers, what does a boom mount look like? You showed us the...
Yes, ma'am. It is on sheet C... I believe it's C3 of your plans, and I can put it up on your board. It's merely a flush mount design where that protrudes approximately 3 to 5 feet from the center line of the tower. So if you have, and I apologize for the rudimentary, but if you have the pencil being a pole, with a flush mount, your antennas will be mounted immediately on the pole surface. With a boom mount design that Verizon would like to install on this site, rather than being mounted flush with the tower, a platform is erected 3 to 5 feet from the tower, and so you push it out, and then a triangle is constructed 3 to 5 feet from the tower. And along the sides of the triangle that's mounted to the side of the tower, you can place 3 antennas on each side. So you would have a total of 9 antennas at each mounting height, as opposed to 3 antennas at each mounting height. And actually, you can get even more antennas with a boom-mounted design. It will hold a total of 12, 4 antennas along each side.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Head.
Thank you.
At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward, state your name and address, any comments that you might have. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My name is Penny Jaycott, and I'm here as the property owner to the land adjacent to the property proposed with the proposed tower. I have given you a letter here today, and I want to read the letter to you because I want you to have this information right now, while you're considering the vote. I would like to know how you work this thing, so I could put these photographs up for anyone considering. Let's see, how do you do it? Let's try doing the other one first. Okay. All right. I do want to say here in the onset, you can't quite get the impact that you would get when you actually see these towers. And when you're standing below them and you're looking up at them, they're an enormous structure. We're not talking about something that's a small object, even though it may appear that way here in this photographs. I've taken these photographs so that you could have an impact. You could see the impact of the tower in the area here. This is the River Rock Tower. I don't know who the owner is of this tower. It's quite a bit taller, of course, than the telephone lines. You can see that the distance. Off in the distance there, you can see the tower way exceeding the height of the telephone lines. And you can see how, Ms. Mosley, you were asking what the boom-mounted antenna look like, and this is what they look like. But unfortunately, like I said, you cannot really get the impact of what these things look like until you're actually on them. Let's see if I can fix that. You see that? Okay. And you can see there is a little bit of a difference in the design. I'm not certain how. I believe this one is more characteristic of the one that we're talking about here. And this is what the bottom looks like at that particular site. And you can see why it's important to have these things hidden, because they're certainly not very attractive. We're talking about putting this tower at a very visible location on Bridge Avenue. And as I said, I want to read the letter to you because I have taken quite a bit of time to put my thoughts together, and I think this would be the best way for me to relay that to you.
I know, Ms. Jacob, I've had an opportunity to read the letter.
You have?
I certainly don't. I have. I certainly don't have any objection to you hitting the highlights, and I don't know if we need it read to us, but if you want to go through it and hit the highlights, I think that'd be appropriate.
Okay. All right. Well, let me, for just a moment here, show you some photographs of a site on Sulphur Springs. This is a more attractive site, and it's more of the thought that I had here about what would be appropriate at this very visible location. The top of the tower here is the stealth construction. It's painted white. It is 90 feet tall. It does not have the impact of the other towers. And in this particular site, it's sitting in quite a bit of natural vegetation. You can see the tower at the top there. Quite a bit of difference. And then the bottom of that structure is enclosed in the white vinyl fencing that I believe Mr. Head was suggesting. I don't know what his fence looks like. And this photograph right here is the impact that the tower would have on the public as they pass by this location. It's right at the roadway, and this is a clear area. I do appreciate the photographs that were taken by the city employees there, and you can see that this is not going to be something hidden off into the side of this particular street. And while this is an animal shelter that I own adjacent to the site, it's still very much a wildlife preserve in the back of it. It does now have the greenways running across the other side of the river. But this is very much a wildlife area, so we're not talking about something that is heavy industrial in appearance. And I have taken great care to take care of my property. When I bought when I purchased the land, it was a farm, and even though it is an animal shelter, there are not pens of dogs running in the area. This is all completely enclosed in a very small section of the lot, and the lot is manicured and well cared for. In terms of highlighting the points that I made here, I've asked that the 45-foot height variance not be approved, also that the special use permit not be approved here. And my points, if I can go through them quickly here, are that the staff comments, and I quote, are that the tower will be very prominent on Bridge Avenue, as the area where the tower is proposed to be located has been cleared of any vegetation. The landowner has removed all of the natural vegetation that was native to the area. There's no trees to do any kind of screening, as you saw in the site on Sulphur Springs. And I understand the zoning ordinance. I've explained that here, that my understanding of it. I have owned the property again for 9 years, and during that time, there's been a lot of effort made in improving the site. Okay, I bring on the third page here, I'm bringing to your attention where I think that the proposed project does not meet the guidelines of our zoning ordinance, and I say that the proposed building or use will not have, The proposed telecommunications tower would substantially and adversely impact the character of the entire neighborhood. It would have an undue adverse effect upon the overall appearance of the market value of the properties in the area by substantially decreasing their desirability to potential buyers. I truly believe that is the case. In point number 2, I say the tower would permanently and substantially alter the natural and scenic features of the area by destroying the scenic vista of the neighborhood. We're all aware of what scenic vista is now. We're all aware of what aesthetics are. We're a progressive society here and community here in this town, and I'm wanting to continue to have that progress. The adjacent, the city planning staff comments have recommended that the BZA not approve the height variance requested unless the applicant commits to installing only flush mount antenna on the tower. I personally prefer the stealth design, and as for the height, it certainly shouldn't exceed 90 feet. I don't know that it needs to be even at the 90-foot level, but the white paint does seem to blend in well. It seems to blend in better with the sky than what the metal steel finish looks like. And when you look at these towers, it doesn't look quite as industrial. And then in point 4, I say the tower would be exceedingly detrimental to all of the residential and commercial properties in the vicinity due to its incompatible design and purpose. And I'm asking for the redesign of the structure that makes it more compatible with the environment that the tower would be in. In point 5, I'm asking BZA consider that the leased area is at least 50 feet or more. 50 feet or more in fill material, and that the content of the soil there is primarily that has been used as clear from projects that the landowner has used. There's probably a substantial amount of asphalt in the site. I don't believe it's compatible with growing any kind of plant materials. And I don't know about any kind of practical value in removing some of that and then putting soil on top of that. It would probably create long-term maintenance problems that we would be stuck with, considering the fact that this is going to be a long-term project. And in my point 6, I'm making a point that if the applicant is not willing to change the tower design to one more compatible with the properties on Bridge Avenue by significantly reducing its carrier service requirements, then it must find another location for its purpose. I feel that that is the only way to look at this from the standpoint of the adjacent property, that this isn't going to be, as I said, a short-term commitment, and that it's not likely that it will be an asset, as Mr. Head said, to the adjacent property or to the town in its present design. And you have had an opportunity to read the letter?
We have.
Okay, I didn't realize that when I spoke. Okay. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about my concerns if you have some.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Jaycott. Any questions for Ms. Jaycott? All right, thank you very much. Anyone else present wishing to speak for or against this application? And seeing none, we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further comments or motion.
I have a question, Chairman Rogers, just with respects to the, and I know, Mr. Blomley, this what you're asking for is the flush mount, but I guess I'm curious as to what the difference in the efficiency is between a flush mount and actually a stealth tower. If one of the Verizon folks could address that question, I would appreciate it.
I believe there are radio frequency engineers here, and I would imagine he could answer that question.
Yes, sir. There's not much difference between a flush mount and a stealth mount in that regard.
Sir, could you state your name,
pretty much one and
please?
the same as far as
Could you state your name for us?
Oh,
please?
I'm sorry. My name's Alex Wagner. I'm a radio frequency engineer for Verizon Wireless.
Alex Wagner?
Yep.
Thank you.
There is not much difference between a flush mount tower and a stealth mount tower as far as the number of carriers or the limitations that we describe in the letter I provided. So pretty much they're one and the same. The only difference really is cost.
Thank
and
you.
color, for that matter.
Yeah. Mr. Blomley, are you dictating in here what type of fence that in your staff comments, or are you leaving that up to us?
In my communications prior to it, Mr. Head making application, I communicated to him that I thought that the requirement of the tower on Sulphur Springs Road, that be the white vinyl fence, that has, in my opinion anyway, and in the opinion of others that I've spoken with, has turned out to be an aesthetically pleasing site as far as the base area. And so I indicated to him that I thought that would be an appropriate type of fence, and he and his clients did not have any issues with that. Certainly, if you're looking to go in a different direction, I'm sure they're listening.
Is that the pole that's behind the church there on Sulphur Springs?
That's correct.
That had the temporaries out to the side? The
portables?
Right.
Yes.
Mr. Wagner, Mr. Head, you're showing on the plans that the Verizon rack will be actually the lowest mounted rack, and that the co-locators are anticipated to be above that. At what height do you anticipate the Verizon rack to be?
Mr. Chairman, that depends on whether the board requires a flush mount design or a boom mounted design. If a boom mounted design is granted, Verizon could mount antennas only at the 65-foot level. If a flush mounted design is required, Verizon would need to take additional center lines above that at 65 feet, 75 feet, and 85 feet.
Does any of those, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Just real quickly, would it, if as a flush mount design, then we does that eliminate co-locators, or is it still the possibility to co-locate?
There is a possibility
For one other.
For one on the very top rung. Other carriers might, I can't speak for them, run into the same issues of Verizon. Because of the extreme growth your city is experiencing, many antennas are needed to serve customers in the area. There would be only one spot left if a flush mount design were used, and that one spot would be confined to 3 antennas. So Verizon needs 9 antennas for this site to fulfill its purposes, hence its need for the 3 center lines if this board chose to mandate a flush mount design. I have no idea if other carriers could make the site usable with only 3 antennas, or if they would need numerous antennas as well. So the short answer is there's a spot for 3 more antennas. Whether another carrier would come on the site and spend the money to do so for only 3 antennas, I can't answer.
But if there was another co-locator with a flush mount design, would they need all the way up to 120, or could they locate somewhere lower?
65 feet is the lowest I've ever seen anyone erect antennas.
Your rack is going to be there.
Right.
I'm asking if there's a co-locator with a flush mount design, would they have to go all the way up to 120, or is it possible that what I'm getting at is, do we need all this height variance?
Right. For a flush mount design, Verizon certainly needs at least 2, 3, so you're talking, and please, I'd like for the board to note, the actual height of the tower is 110 feet. There's 10 feet for a lightning rod. So a flush mount design it would be 65 feet, 75 feet, 85 feet, and 95 feet. And then you've got, I guess there's extra on top, or there could be different spaces. I can defer to the engineer here to answer that question. I will say Verizon would need a minimum of a 85 plus or 90 plus 10-foot lightning rod, so the minimum Verizon would need to fill its space would be 100 feet.
Okay.
And that would mean no space
Co-locators.
at all for co-locators.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Dodd, I don't know if you had a question.
It may be the engineer's question. It's just a follow-up to what you had asked. Based on his prior answer that there's really not much difference in a stealth mount versus a flush mount, would those distances that we've just been given for the antenna still apply on a stealth mount type pole? Would that still be consistent with the minimum height needs of Verizon?
Yes, sir, they would. The issue, I guess, when you're talking, we're co-locating at the lowest possible height so we can reduce the size of the overall structure. When we're talking about putting a carrier below 65 feet, I'd imagine the primary objective, coverage objective of any carrier would be kind of the Stones River Mall. I don't think you could go lower than 65 feet and serve customers in that area. I mean, just due to the existing trees and structures on Old Fort Parkway to the north, I don't think you would be able to have a feasible site.
Yeah,
at that height.
he had answered, I think, 65 would be a bare minimum. I guess I'm trying to figure out an absolute maximum. If we had a stealth pole design, is the 100 feet that he just told us for the flush mount equally applicable?
Yes, sir.
To the stealth?
Yeah, typically the compartments in a stealth mount would be 10 feet apart, so we're looking at a carrier per 10 feet.
65, 75, and 85.
And the same issue applies where we would occupy, at 3 center lines as well. So we'd have a
That
center
would be
line
yours,
each
and then to
10
have
feet
a
and 10 feet
co-locator,
above.
be another 10.
65, 75, and 85 with an additional carrier up above.
So like 105 with the lightning rod, with one co-locator.
Chairman Rogers, I'm just going to give an opinion. This is not a motion at this point, but I don't really have an issue with the height of the tower in and of itself or what you're asking for, as long as it has somewhat of an appealing look to it. And we've dealt with these towers over the last couple of years, and we've even dealt with one in the last couple of months that wasn't done as it was originally specified, but that's not y'all's issue. So my opinion would be that if we were to grant this, that we look at a stealth tower. I don't have an issue with the height because it would be a stealth tower. And again, opinion would be that it would not necessarily be painted, because I would say that that's a maintenance issue that you would have to long be dealing with. But if I'm to vote yes for this, that's the direction that I would be going in.
Height is one of the things that bothers me about it. It's just so visible there. That is a area that's highly visible. There's a lot of green space there. The property's already been modified by this fill. Really, the character of the property's already been changed by all the backfill to bring it out of a floodway. And then you talk about an industrial-type boom-mounted silver pole. One of our conditions is the scenic to keep the scenic area in the same condition in a scenic fashion is one of the considerations. And that's really kind of my biggest problem with it, is just seems out of place. So anything we can do, if we're inclined to grant it, to minimize that impact, and it seems to me that stealth would be the way to do that. I kind of do like the painting it white with the white vinyl fence to improve the aesthetics of it, but that's just such a highly traveled area right there, and it's just right there on the road. Even the pole behind the church is off of, certainly it impacts the property owners, and it's got some hidden vegetation, but, it's not right there on a major thoroughfare. And we may not, I don't know if we can craft it enough to impact the scenic, or to minimize the scenic impact on it. At least that's my concern, to make it, feasible or viable for Verizon. But obviously, our concern is my concern is the surrounding, how it impacts that surrounding area, the greenway, the river's right there, and it just seems to be a pretty intrusive type structure, given all that's around it.
All right. Certainly welcome any other comments that the board members may have. I guess we'll take these, as Mr. Ballamy indicated, in separate motions. Let's address first a special use permit in order to construct the telephone transmission tower itself.
I'll make a motion. I'll get this thing started. I'll make a motion that we grant the variance subject to the vinyl fence, as we spoke of, all staff comments, that it be a stealth tower, and from an aesthetic value that it is painted white, and we'll deal with the height variance in a minute. That's my motion.
You did mention variance when you made your motion. Did you mean special use permit?
I
Mr.
did.
Halliburton?
Sorry.
I have a motion. Is there a second? I will second that. All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
Okay, that motion then passed by 4-1 vote. Or, fair to say? Okay. 4-1 vote.
Chairman Rogers, I would just like to clarify for the record, Mr. Halliburton, just to clarify your condition about the tower being of stealth construction. That is a tower with the antenna mounted inside the tower structure itself, correct?
Okay, then next we will consider the request for the 45-foot variance of the 75-foot maximum permitted building height in a commercial highway zone to allow this 120-foot tall structure.
Here again, to the extent we can minimize the impact, it just, I think the math worked out to be 105 would be a minimum where it could have one co-locator. We've already imposed the stealth. Whether that's financially feasible for Verizon or not, I'm not sure, but I think they're asking for, 45? If I were to vote for something on the height, that would be my motion to then approve a 30-foot variance on height as opposed to 45.
If I could get a clarification from the applicant as far as the stealth construction, I know with the monopole they have the 10-foot lightning rod on top. Would a lightning rod be placed on top of the stealth tower as well? If they could answer that question for us.
Yes, a lightning rod would be placed on top.
10 foot again.
Yes.
And Mr. Head, just to make sure our math is correct, is 105, does that allow for one co-locator inside a stealth pole?
Our engineer says you need 115, and something if we could bring to the board's attention, in addition to the heights, when you mount antennas internally, it will be wider at the top. Just wanted the board to be aware of that, as it does affect the aesthetics. So you would have a wider pole at the top as opposed to a more narrow monopole.
Will that affect the fall radius?
It shouldn't. The engineering letter that we've provided is for a traditional monopole tower, but we can certainly, it can be constructed so that it would fall within the on the property of the landowner in the event of failure. Correct? Yeah, we would have to clarify with the engineer, but we feel confident that it could be constructed in such a manner.
If the original structural letter was purely for the original proposed tower, I would recommend that either as an amendment to the motion for the special use permit, or as part of the motion for the height variance, if you so choose to grant them the height variance, is that a revised letter addressing the fall radius for the required stealth tower be submitted, showing that the fall radius does not encroach onto any adjacent properties or onto the Bridge Avenue public right-of-way. Would that be a correct thing to do, Mr. Ives?
So, yes, it would be.
I guess I need to back my motion out based on them saying now 115. I understood 65, 75, 85, co-locator at 95 and 10 feet for a pole. So that was what I was basing my 105 on. They're now saying 115. So I'll take my motion back on the 105.
Okay. Get a motion on the floor then.
I'll make a motion that we grant the height variance at 115, subject to the staff comments, including the fact of getting the engineering report that dictates that the fall variance or distance is the same as it was originally.
The 50-foot fall radius
Right.
as outlined in the original letter.
Is there a second? I think I will second that one as well. All right, there being a motion and a second, any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
No.
Okay, I believe that one passes by a 4-1 vote as well. All right, I believe we have disposed of that application, Mr. Head. I appreciate you all coming in today. Thank you very much. All right, we are off to a slow start here. Application Z09047 by Mr. Bob Ziegenfuss of Interplan LLC for Primrose School Franchising Company, requesting a special use permit in order to construct a daycare center in an office general zone for property located along the south side of Brandy's Circle, which is Lot 23 of the Cason Square Subdivision. Mr. Blum, if you'd review that application, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Our third application today, as you mentioned, is located in the Cason Square Subdivision on Brandy's Circle. Bear with me just a moment. All right. Subject property is located as shown on the aerial photograph here. It is here on in the curve in Brandy Circle, which is the property is zoned OG, Office General. The applicants are proposing a daycare use, which requires a special use permit in the Office General zoning district. As you can see, directly to the east of the subject property is Old Time Pottery, specifically the southern end of the Old Time Pottery lot, which is their warehousing area. Brandy Circle and the Cason Square subdivision have a number of existing office buildings adjacent to the subject property, several here along the tree line separating Cason Square from the Countryside Subdivision to the south, and there's now an existing office building here directly across the street from the subject property, which is Lot 23. There is a strip of land that the GIS system and the property assessor's office show to be owned by Old Time Pottery, 30-foot strip of land directly to the south of the subject property. And further to the south of that strip of land is the Countryside Subdivision, which is zoned RS-15 and consists of single-family residential lots. As opposed to in times past, the daycare center use now has specific standards that are required to be met, and those standards are the same as the standards that are required for family daycare homes and group daycare homes. Previously, daycare centers, which are more of a commercial type use as opposed to family group daycare homes, which are operated out of someone's residence, they had no additional standards. Now the zoning ordinance has been amended so that the daycare centers have the same additional standards as family and group daycare homes. The applicant has demonstrated compliance with those additional standards. As I'll go over with you in just a moment, he's got adequate parking and loading and unloading space on the property, no areas that will require backing out onto the public right-of-way. One of the requirements is that the applicant demonstrate compliance with all state standards. As I've mentioned in times past, even though this is a standard that's in our zoning ordinance, it's something that I found that the state, the Department of Human Services, is typically not willing to provide at this stage. They usually say, go to the city, see if you can obtain your zoning entitlement, and then we'll investigate whether or not you're going to be compliant with the state requirements. So one of the conditions that staff recommends is that the proposed daycare center must comply with all requirements of the state of Tennessee. Department of Human Services and a copy of the state license must be provided to the planning staff prior to the center opening for business. Because we found that that condition can't actually be met prior to the Board of Zoning Appeals meeting. Now just to show you a little bit of the site itself. That's looking back towards the tree row that is along the shared property line with the Old Time Pottery warehouse to the east. That tree line is proposed to be removed. This is a little bit of a broader view looking back towards the warehouses. You can tell, with the exception of the eastern and southern property lines, the property is generally, the only vegetation is just grass.
I'm sorry, Matthew, the trees on the side of the warehouse that's existing,
Yes,
you're saying that that's proposed to be removed?
that is correct.
And is that on the subject property, or is that on Old Time Pottery?
I believe they are on the subject
That's on
property.
the subject property. But the back side is, well, I'll let you, I'm sorry, I may be getting ahead, but I'm just
Yeah,
trying to figure out which trees are theirs and which ones aren't.
Right, and actually, this is the tree row along the back side of the subject property, and the applicant is showing those to be protected. Most of those trees are actually on that 30-foot strip to the south of the subject property, and there's another issue with that 30-foot strip that I'll get into in a moment that could affect the preservation of those trees. Just to kind of give you a feel for the look and appearance of the surrounding office buildings. This is what's directly to the west on the property next door. This is looking down the street. As you can tell, all of the office buildings in this subdivision are predominantly brick. This is what's directly across the street. This is a picture of this is actually taken from that back tree row, and this is a picture of the vegetation as you're looking back towards the east. The other developments through that area along the south side of Brandy Circle have actually installed an 8-foot tall wooden privacy fence with landscape buffer materials on the Casement Square side of that fence. And the applicant is looking to do the same thing in this instance, except with a white vinyl fence. I brought the large board down, but I do have a rendering of this I can show you. This is actually the proposed architecture of the building. As you can see, they are proposing an all brick and stone product as well to be compatible with the buildings in the Casement Square subdivision. Now to go over the site with you a little bit. Subject property would actually have access via its very limited frontage there on Brandy Circle. Parking would be along the west and north sides of the property. The building itself is proposed to be 11,673 square feet, and there would be approximately 12,500 square feet of outside playground area that would be primarily along the east side of the building and along the southwest side of the building. The dumpster enclosure will actually be at the near the northeast corner of the property. Staff recommended to the applicant that be moved as far away from the residences as possible. The dumpster enclosure itself will match the brick facade of the building. A Type B buffer is required when OG abuts RS-15. This is their landscape plan. The applicant is proposing to save the existing trees along the southern property line. They are proposing to remove the existing trees along the eastern property line, and of course, minimum landscaping standards would have to be met along all other property lines and along the parking lot. The one issue that I was discussing before was there's some discrepancy between who actually owns the 30-foot strip behind them to the south. The applicant represented on their plans that was owned by Old Time Pottery, which they have provided a deed reference that shows that property up to a point is owned by Old Time Pottery, but we have no deed reference that shows that the remainder of that property is owned by Old Time Pottery, of that 30-foot strip. We have evidence that from about here back towards the east, it is owned by Old Time Pottery, but from here back to the west to Cason Lane, we don't know that for certain because we don't have a deed book reference to verify that. The applicant is proposing to do extensive off-site grading on that 30-foot strip in order to help accommodate the drainage for the property, for the development. And he is in negotiations currently with Old Time Pottery to use that 30-foot strip. However, if he is not able to use that 30-foot strip, there would be underground piping done on site, and he already has an alternative plan in mind in case he is not able to get permission to use that 30-foot strip as part of his grading and drainage plan. He mentioned to me before the meeting, the applicant's engineer did, or Mr. Ziegenfuss, that if they have to contain all of their drainage on site, that the pipe along the southern portion of the property may compromise the integrity of the existing tree line. With that being said, one of the conditions that staff has proposed is that existing tree line be preserved as it has been along that property line. As you all know, one of the best types, or probably the best type of buffer, is when there's an existing mature tree line there, and they're proposing to add the 8-foot tall fence and the additional materials, which with the existing tree row, the fence, and the proposed materials would be more than adequate for a Type B buffer. But one of the things that staff would not be in favor of would be the disturbance of that existing tree line. We would like that protected and to remain intact in order to protect the neighbors to the south. With that being said, a couple other points. The daycare center would be open 6:30 a.m. through 6:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. The materials submitted indicate that some children will be transported via a Primrose school bus, and that's actually just a small van similar to what we use on the ride-around. The applicant has indicated that the center will care for 172 children and will have 22 employees at peak times of operation. With that being said, if the board approves this application, staff recommends the following conditions. The subject development must receive site plan approval from the Planning Commission. As a function of its site plan review, the Planning Commission will also have final architectural review of the development, and all building orientation requirements must be met to the satisfaction of the Planning Commission. Number 2, the final landscape plan will be subject to the review and approval of the city horticulturist prior to the issuance of building permits. The landscape plan should include provisions so that the existing mature tree line along the south lot line shall not be disturbed. And number 3, the proposed daycare center must comply with all requirements of the State of Tennessee Department of Human Services, and a copy of the state license must be provided to the planning staff prior to the center opening for business. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions, and Mr. Ziegenfuss is here if you have any questions for him.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
When you say that trees aren't conditioned that the trees not be disturbed, we're not certain, did they do a tree survey? Do we know how many of those trees are on theirs and on the strip, whoever owns it?
They did. Very few of those trees are actually on their property, and I believe that's the last page. I think it's sheet L1.1.
So is the condition then on the property, not to disturb the trees on their property, or, I mean, I see what I'm trying to get at?
I do, and that's where
That's where it gets fuzzy?
It's muddied a little bit,
Okay.
because those existing trees are mostly not on their property, and if it is determined that Old Time Pottery owns that entire strip, and they work out a lease agreement with Old Time Pottery to be able to use that for off-site grading and drainage, then it would be easier for them to control those trees. And but a lot hinges on who actually owns that strip and what grading and drainage plan will be the one that will effectively be used.
But I guess my question still remains is if we put this condition on them, it just puts them in the spot, and no matter who owns the trees, whether on their property, on the adjacent property, we don't want them taking the trees down, cutting them down, clearing that out, basically.
That is correct.
Regardless. If somebody determined that the homeowners end up owning those and they cut them down, then that's outside the scope of what, I mean, we can't require the adjacent homeowners to, if they end up owning the trees or whatever.
That's correct.
Okay. And just another question, is there any area in which a daycare can operate as a right, or do they all come to special use?
If it's in a commercial zoning district, like commercial highway, commercial local, or an industrial zoning district, then they're allowed by right. But in the office zoning classifications,
Okay.
They're seen as being a little bit more of an intrusive use than a traditional 9 to 5 office use. And I would think that's primarily because of the outdoor component the outdoor playground that goes along with a daycare use, and especially because the Office General Zoning District is many times used as a transitional zoning district from a heavier commercial zone adjacent to a residential zone. So in many cases, the OG zoning district is directly adjacent to single-family zoning, as it is in this case.
You know, when I say one more, then, you know, that always means more. That brought up something else. With that single entry on that and such a large facility and pickup and drop-off times, if we looked at the traffic flow, the way it's laid out in there, has anybody, staff looked at that, comfortable with how they've got that set up? Has that been addressed?
Yes, we met with the applicant, and Mr. Balachandra, our traffic engineer, was a part of that meeting. There were a few modifications that he had the applicant make on the plans in order to make traffic flow more smoothly. The one thing that he was more concerned about was the design of the site and its effect on the public right-of-way. The applicant actually had a couple of more parking spaces that were closer to that entrance that could have compromised the ability for vehicles to enter and exit the site. Those spaces have been removed so that there are no conflicts with incoming and outgoing traffic. And what actually happens on the site with regards to the amount of traffic that they are bringing internally, that is not as much of a concern as what is actually happening on the public right-of-way.
And I guess
I'm sorry.
Planning will look at that too on the site plan, huh?
That's correct. The actual design of the site will be subject to Planning Commission review. This is one that will require Planning Commission review by ordinance because of its size.
But traffic was comfortable with the impact on the public road there and the access and all that?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Ziegenfuss, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman. My name is Bob Ziegenfuss, 933 Lee Road, Orlando, Florida. I'm the engineer of record for the project here representing Primrose School as well. I'll speak to a few things. Thank you, Matthew's done a great job of giving the introduction and dispensing with some of the details. I will put, and we might have to zoom this out, Matthew. I think I might be able to figure that out. Since the time we made our application, Mr. Blomley had put up some elevations of the building. And he had two elevations. We now have all four colored elevations of that building to show you here today, so I thought I'd show that for reference purposes. You're looking at very similar elevations around all four sides of this building. The most important ones are the ones facing the public right-of-way, which are listed as the front and right elevations, as you see there, and those were the ones that were previously presented by Mr. Blomley. Primrose, typically, their typical building is a stucco with the brick course at the bottom. Being that this is in a development that's predominantly actually 100% brick buildings and the rest of the Case and Square development, they've decided to spend a little bit of extra money to go to a brick and stone prototype so that we are compatible with the other buildings in the area. In dealing with the proximity to the adjacent residential development, this is the rear of the property, north facing up, south is the residential, the Countryside Subdivision. The required Type B buffer that is required between the zoning category and residential is a 20-foot wide buffer, Type B buffer. We are providing that 20-foot wide buffer. Also, in addition to that, on our site, there's another 10-foot of green area, landscape area that's going to be between that 20-foot wide buffer and the fenced playground area. So we essentially have an increased buffer in that area being 30 feet. Taking into account the existing trees that we were just talking about and the other 30-foot piece of property that's behind us, irrespective of who owns it, it provides a 60-foot buffer in lieu of the required 20-foot buffer for the Type B. So we feel that that provides an even more adequate buffer given the existing trees, the 8-foot vinyl fence that we'll be putting up, and also the landscaping that we'll be installing. That provides a very significant buffer between our facility and the residential development to the south. Matthew's really touched on quite a few of the points that I wanted to touch on, the hours of operation and how that plays in. Typically the 9 to 5 is what you'd like to see for that office category. We are 6:30 to 6:30, still primarily daytime hours, Monday through Friday, no weekends or nights, which is probably the most important thing when dealing with this type of use next to a residential zoning district. In talking in more detail about this 30-foot strip of land behind us, the research we've done, our survey did indicate, as Mr. Blomley had told you, that we have provided deed information that shows up to a certain point behind our property it's owned by Old Time Pottery. What we're thinking is, and we're researching this now, is that there's just a different deed of record that hasn't been brought to the forefront yet that shows that Old Time Pottery owns the rest of that 30-foot strip all the way out to Kaysen. The property appraiser's website, although we can't verify that it's accurate, the property appraiser's website does indicate that Old Time Pottery, the same piece of property that they own, the large piece where their warehouse and facility is, that same property owner does own all the way over to Kaysen. So the indications we have now are that Old Time Pottery does own that entire strip of land. We are in discussions with them now to utilize that land. If for some reason they don't own the entire strip heading west all the way out to Kaysen, we'll be dealing with that property owner as well to get permission to do that work. I wanted to further clarify what that is and what that work entails and why we're proposing that. Hopefully this blows it up enough to help me describe what's going on. Southeast, just off the page to the southeast, which would be the bottom right side of the page, there is a drainage pipe that discharges off-site flow to this 30-foot strip of land behind both the Old Time Pottery and behind this Kaysen Square development. In our previous discussions with city staff, when I met with Mr. Blomley and also with Mr. Huddleston to discuss this project, they had expressed a concern about that drainage flow. What has happened is that pipe does come from the south to the north, draining at least a portion of that subdivision. When Old Time Pottery developed, they created a high point there, and that, from what I can tell from my record searches and looking at old contoured aerials and those types of things, that drainage flow used to flow onto the Old Time Pottery site. When they developed, it forced us to be the low point, so that drainage now comes through our site and then discharges onto Brandy Circle. As part of our development, obviously, we don't want to create an issue back there. We want to help the city's drainage issues in that area and make sure that we get that water to where it needs to go. So that work that's being proposed on the 30-foot abandoned roadway easement is what I'm calling it behind us, is not necessarily, it's not part of our stormwater management system that's required on our parcel. If we could go back to that plan. We have a swale that's contained within our property to handle our stormwater management. You then have a bermed area where those existing trees are, and then we would create a secondary swale in that 30-foot, and that is to handle that off-site drainage flow that currently now goes through our property. We are going to be routing it around our property and taking it to an existing drainage pipe that's at the southwest corner of our property that then heads north and discharges into the Brandy Circle drainage system. So this is in an effort to handle that off-site drainage flow. It's not necessarily to benefit our property as part of our drainage system. We would make all attempts, with our plan now, we're proposing to utilize that area, and with that plan would be able to keep the trees without a problem. Our alternate solution to this is to create all of the necessary pipe work and drainage work on our site to direct that same water I was just describing to Brandy Circle, but do it all on our property. This would involve that drainage flow still going through surface drainage flow over land, across that 30-foot easement, westerly to our southeast property corner, into a drainage inlet, and then we would then pipe it out to Brandy Circle. And what Mr. Blomley was referring to is that pipe that we would need to install, if we could go back to the plan one more time. That pipe we would need to install, if you can see there, the contouring that's on that plan, you have that strip of trees that is in the 30-foot area. If you head north from there before you start heading into the downslope of our drainage swale that we're creating around there, we would put it in that berm area there, north of that tree line. And the concern that Mr. Blomley was expressing was that when you put it in that berm, if you compromise, we wouldn't have to tear the trees down. The concern is if we compromise root systems. So great care would have to be taken in order to get that in. Some other things could be done. The site drainage system could be completely redesigned, take that swale out, and then we would have a nice 20-foot wide flat area with some landscaping in it that we could put that drainage pipe into. So we have several options that we could entertain. Utilizing the old-time pottery land is probably the most feasible and most cost-effective way to handle it. That's why we're heading at that one first. So I hope that further describes that situation back there. And with that, if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ziegenfuss. Any questions?
I have one, just a curiosity question. It sounds like you're going to need to figure out this 30-foot area, like who owns it, so you know what your what your drainage plan is going to be. Do you anticipate knowing when that is? Because can they even get a grading permit until they have a plot plan as to where their drainage is going to end up going?
No, they would need an approved grading plan, and that approved grading plan would come as a part of the site plan submittal to the Planning Commission.
All right. I mean, I was just...
Yeah, we're trying to deal with both issues at the same time.
Yes.
Obviously, we're here today to deal with the use issue and getting the approval for the use. And like I said, we have, in my head right now, we have 3 different options of how to handle this drainage flow. And if we need to handle it by bringing it through our site in a drainage easement, then so be it. That's the way we'll handle it.
And I think that staff's desire would be that no matter which of the 3 options he ends up going with for the grading and drainage plan, that a condition be that those trees not be disturbed, and that's there are some of those trees that are straddling the property line, some are on the adjacent property to the south, but regardless of where those trees fall in relation to this property, that they not be disturbed as a function of the development of this site.
And we do agree with that. We think in being good neighbors to those residents to the south, keeping those existing trees is very important. They're very mature, as you saw in the pictures, and provide a great buffer. So we're in agreement with that and would make all efforts to do that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ziegenfuss.
Thank you.
At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward.
Hello, my name is Aubrey Willard. I live at 2518 Spalding Circle, and I am the person in the northeast corner of this lot they're talking about that the water drains. That's not draining right now. The day before yesterday, or even yesterday afternoon, we had water in the yard because at one time when they were developing over there, they filled in this holding pond that was on the other side of the fence, and they had to open it back up. Now, where it drains out now, I don't know, but I think it comes in on the old type pottery. Pardon me, I'm kind of nervous. But where it's supposed to go, I have no idea. But all I know is a holding pond there. Had no problem with it before. And now it backs up into my yard, my neighbor's yard, across the back of my yard. And there's been a drain tile there, which had been stopped up. It had been opened up by the city engineer, opened it up. It was a ditch across this 30-foot right-of-way and run it back into the holding pond because the drainage tile had been stopped. And that's my concern, not with the daycare center. It's my concern of a big dumpster being in my backyard and the water standing on my property. The old-time pottery did buy the 30-foot right-of-way from River Rock to the back corner of my yard. All right, it was owned by Ernest Burgess, Andy Adams, all of the property owners of the racket club at one time. They deeded it to MTSU. What happened to it from there, who old-time party brought it from, I have no idea. But I do know they owned that right-of-way through there at one time. And that was before racket club, River Rock, or anything was put in. That's the only way they could get back to the big greenhouse, which was in front of the racket club. I've got 35 years of history on it, so. But I've been living in this house for close to 23 years, and I don't want water backed up in my yard no more if I can help it. They put a box cover it from down the side of the interstate, come all the way back up the exit ramp, come into Verizon property and Old Time property to drain that. Why have I got to be backed up with water? I have no problem with the daycare center, don't get me wrong. But the dumpster thing they said he's going to put in my backyard, it concerns the Bartels. He's here too. I think they'd be dumped plenty of time. But I'd like to have the buffer as far as the fence there. And I don't want the drainage stopped up. There's no other way for it to go. And I'm taking in Racket Club, all down Spalding, the Spalding Circle, all comes to where the point down beside my house. So, who owns the rest of that 30-foot right-of-way? I have no idea. But at one time, like I said, Andy Adams and the investors of the Racket Club originally owned that right-of-way. They deeded it to MTSU. And how Old Time Pottery got their part of it, I don't know, but I'm proud they did, because if it didn't, we'd have had a back street. Pardon me, but I don't need a street in front and behind my house. So, take it in consideration that, there's an easement that's been there for 30-something years, drainage. It don't need to be blocked off. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Willard. Any questions for Mr. Willard?
Any questions to me? If
I don't think so.
Answer them, I'll try.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Alan Bartell. I live at 2522 Spalding Circle. If we could go back to the first aerial view that you first put down. Yeah. My house is this one here with the light-colored roof. Mr. Willard, who just spoke to you, lives right here. There's a drainage ditch that goes between his house and the next one over. And it goes down, and all the water collects in there. And I've seen sometimes when we've had some real rainy seasons, this man's backyard right here is almost up to his house underwater. Mr. Willard's house is almost all of his backyard is underwater. My property sits a little bit higher, so I get some water, but not that much. But the drainage has been a headache for 23 years. I've been in my house for 23 years. It was brand new when I moved into it. I have no problem with the daycare center. Fact is, I welcome a daycare center behind me. There's nothing better neighbors hardly than having laughing and kids playing. I think it's wonderful. So I'd be very much in favor of a daycare center. This tree line that goes down behind all these areas here, when this whole property back in that area was zoned Office General, a bunch of us from the neighborhood attended the Planning Commission meeting for the changing of the zoning. And it was assured to us that that tree line would never be disturbed. They said that they wanted to keep our privacy from all the offices, and so far that's been done great. The tree lines for behind all those other buildings have been built are left intact. They put up fences, and if they want to put up a fence behind the daycare, that's wonderful. That those are mature trees that's been there forever, and it blocks out lights from the theater and the street lights that go down in that area. It really does a great job. But anyhow, that was assured to us that that would never be disturbed. The property in the 30-foot strip, I share also, and in my yard. Like Mr. Willard said, I think originally it belonged to the Racket Club. That strip was used as an access road back when Old Time Pottery and the Outlets Limited Mall, which is now Verizon Wireless, that was used for all the dump trucks and equipment to go back and forth while the construction was underway for all that. But when that was finished, then it was no longer used. It actually was kind of a gravel road. There's still some remnants of gravel left way in the back behind our yards. But all the residents on that street have mowed the grass, taken care of it, even though that 30-foot strip is not ours. And I think we all take pride in the way it looks. And so I'd hate to see any of that actually disturbed again. I know Mr. Willard told me a few weeks ago there was somebody surveying back there, and he asked them what they were doing, and they said, oh, well, they're thinking of building a road back here so they could bring garbage trucks and stuff like that to come into behind these businesses. And I said, oh, no, don't cut it, you know. And when he told them that one section behind the Old Time Pottery warehouse belongs to Old Time Pottery, then they kind of packed up their gear and left. And like I think it originally was from Racket Club, then we heard that it was deeded to MTSU, and they own that whole strip all the way down to Cason Lane. And then when they built the Old Time Pottery warehouse, they built it actually almost too close to the property lines. So as I understand, then that's when Old Time Pottery bought that section behind their warehouse all the way over to River Rock. And therefore they had the proper distance behind their facility and the neighbors. But the other part of the 30-foot strip that runs from where they own all the way over to Cason Lane, I don't know who owns it now. Last I heard, MTSU had the deed to it. I don't know. I'd love to buy the strip behind my house. Then there wouldn't be any more problem with that. But my big concern is the tree line and the drainage. I don't want to see all of us get flooded anymore. It'd be nice if that was directed somehow past the tree line on the north side and could be directed into some sewer system or whatever. I don't, however, I'm not a city engineer, so I don't know how that's done. But I ask that the tree line not be disturbed at all, and if they want to build this daycare, by the looks of the plans, the architecture is great. It matches in with all the offices. I'm real happy with the way the offices up there look, because that was one promise they made to us when they zoned that Office General, that the buildings wouldn't be any higher than 2 stories high, and they would all complement the homes in the area, and so far it has. So, it looks like this daycare is going to stay in line with that, and that would be great. I'd be in favor of that, but it's the tree line and the drainage. Those are the only concerns I have.
Thank you, Mr. Bartell. Any questions for Mr. Bartell? All right. Thank you, sir. Anyone else present wishing to speak for or against this application? All right, seeing none, then we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed. And Mr. Ziegenfuss, I'll give you a word here in just a second. There may be some other questions or comments from the board members. Okay. You want to make some final comments?
Yes, please.
Some brief final comments?
I will make it as brief as possible. Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come back up and speak to these two gentlemen's concerns. The use of this 30-foot in our negotiations with Old Time Pottery and whoever else may own it is to fix the drainage problems. That is our intent, is to go in there and this development will be the one that fixes the problem. So that this problem will not happen in the future. So approving this today will help these gentlemen's concerns and all those property owners in that area, because the development of this will fix that problem. And in hearing the concerns and knowing how the history has gone with those trees, they will be saved. No matter however we solve the drainage problem, and whether we use that 30-foot strip or don't use it, your engineers here at the city have already indicated that we will be fixing that drainage problem as part of our development. So it will be fixed and those trees will be saved. And that's all I have.
Thanks, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if I may interject a few things, correct a couple things to be more accurate. Mr. Ziegenfuss before alluded to the Type B buffer being required to be 20 feet wide. Type B buffer is actually a 10-foot wide buffer. They do have 30 feet of green space proposed along their southern property boundary. So they're going above and beyond what's required, but Type B is 10 feet wide. Second of all, Mr. Willard, I believe his name was, said that the dumpster would be adjacent to the residences. I wanted to assure him that was something we as staff thought of when we first began discussing this with Mr. Ziegenfuss and his team, that the dumpster actually be located on the north end of Lot 23, the subject property, in other words. So it would be adjacent to the remainder of the Casey Square subdivision and not adjacent to the Countryside subdivision. Just to clarify that, I wanted to make sure he understood that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bomley. All right, then at this time, the public hearing having been closed, I guess we are ready for any other comments, questions, or motions.
If there are no comments, I'll make a motion, subject to all staff comments, that we approve this special use permit.
Second.
Well, we have a motion and a second. I'll let you pick which one.
Come on. Well, he is the vice chair. I see seniority.
Should we do that by alphabetical order?
No,
or
I think seniority.
by seniority?
I think the chair and vice chairman.
All right. Well, having a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. Mr. Ziegenfuss, that application has been granted. Appreciate you all coming in today, as well as Mr. Willard and Mr. Bartell. Thank you all very much. All right, we'll move now on to special use permit amendment requests. We have application Z09048 by Pastor Verlin Thornton for Restoration Fellowship Church of God of Prophecy, requesting an amendment to a special use permit originally approved on March 12, 2003, allowing an institutional group assembly use, a place of worship, in a residential single-family RS-15 zone for property located at 675 DeJarnett Lane. The applicant wishes to amend his special use permit in order to allow periodic outdoor fundraising and outreach events as permitted accessory uses to the church. Mr. Blomley.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. I think it would have been more polite of the crowd had they waited for you to finish before they gave you your standing ovation.
I thought that was Mr. Young's second over there.
This request should look fairly familiar to the board. Pastor Thornton came before the Board of Zoning Appeals last year for an amendment to the special use permit for his church there at 675 DeJarnett Lane. Of course, the property is zoned RS-15 and institutional group assembly uses. In this case, more specifically, a place of worship is permitted by a special use permit in a single-family residential zoning district. You recall that back in 2003, when this was approved, and in our discussion last year, certain outdoor events were never mentioned as a part of the special use permit approval for the site. Specifically, the applicant had come to the planning department last year and sought to get permission for an antique car show in the church parking lot. Because that was a little bit outside of the paradigm of what we would typically expect for an institutional group assembly use, as well as because of the fact that it would be utilizing off-site areas for parking. For example, they've gotten permission from the school to park in the school parking lot. We felt that it was not in keeping with the original special use permit, with the original special use permit approval, and thus they had to go back to the BZA for an amendment to that special use permit. The applicant made a request to be able to hold several of these types of outdoor events per year. The Board of Zoning Appeals approved his one event last year with the caveat that it was somewhat on a trial basis, and that we would see how the event went last year, and as to whether or not the board would approve any future events. And so the applicant has come back before the Board of Zoning Appeals, and he is requesting the ability to hold 3 such events per year, spaced no less than 3 months apart. Attached to the letter from the applicant, going into more detail about his request. The first of these proposed events would be on Saturday, August 15th from 3 p.m. until 8 p.m. with an August 22nd rain date. And if this special use permit amendment is approved, he would be allowed to have up to 3 of these types of events per year. Now, this is not to preclude him, or this is not to refer to accessory outdoor events that would typically be accessory to a church. There are, or any other institutional group assembly uses. There are certainly events, cookouts, anniversary celebrations, festivals that they could contain within their own property that would be normal and customary for an institutional group assembly use. That would, if that were the case, if it was all contained upon their own property, and if it wasn't a use such as an antique car show, we wouldn't be before the Board of Zoning Appeals seeking an amendment. But because of the circumstances, and because this type of event was not a part of the original special use permit, Pastor Thornton has to come back before the board. But if approved, he would not have to come back before the board if you approve his request. I have provided you a copy of an email from Mr. Gary Anderson with Murfreesboro City Schools, stating that Murfreesboro City Schools has no issue with the applicant utilizing the John Pittard parking lot for this event. As you see in the site plan in your agenda materials, the antique cars would actually be parked on the parking lot of the church, while patron parking would actually be on the school's parking lot. There would be some outdoor amplified music. They're actually proposing that to be located on the in the grassy area on the west side of the church. They said that they can move that to the east side of the church if the board finds that to be more acceptable. At the time of this event last October, I did not receive any complaints. After I sent out the mailers for this request and for this public hearing, I did receive a call from several of the neighbors. 2 of the neighbors said that they had no problems with the event, and I believe all 3 of them were in pretty close proximity, if not next door, to the church property. One of the neighbors said that as opposed to the speakers being oriented to the north, he said that the speakers were actually oriented towards the subdivision, which was contrary to what the church represented at the meeting last year. I did call Pastor Thornton after I spoke with that neighbor, and Pastor Thornton assured me that the speakers were not oriented towards the subdivision. But I did, after I received that initial call, I made a point of asking the other neighbors who called whether or not the event was disruptive in any way, and they did not indicate that it was. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions either before or after the public hearing. If the board approves the special use permit request, staff recommends the following conditions. A tent permit must be obtained from the Building and Codes Department prior to erecting any tent on the subject property. And number 2, the church will be required to obtain permission from Murfreesboro City Schools each time they intend to use the John Pinnard parking lot for event parking. And Pastor Thornton is here if you have any questions for him as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, do we have any examples where we have approved sort of in perpetuity special event similar? I can't recall since I've been on the board that it's basically an activity that's not ancillary to the normal operation for which the special use permit's been granted.
I think that in most instances it's not necessary. I think that in most instances, as I was mentioning, there would be normal outdoor events that we would consider accessory to the church that would not have to come before the Board of Zoning Appeals. For example, if they were having a church birthday celebration and they had, some games outside or some gatherings outside, if it was all contained on their lot. But
well, for instance, I remember Boy Scouts coming here to sell trees on churches. I remember, there's been kind of uses like that we haven't said, okay, you can do that from now on. I know that the ordinance gives people like fireworks vendors and Christmas tree vendors, well, not Christmas tree, it's a bad example, July 4th and New Year's with one trip to kind of save them from coming back in front of the board, but that really only lasts 2 trips. Here, basically, they're asking for an event they would be able to have in perpetuity. I'm just curious as to whether or not there's any precedent for this or if we've done this sort of thing before.
I think the difference between the Boy Scouts at Fellowship United Methodist Church, for example, on 99, that is not a... we actually amended our zoning ordinance to allow the sale of Christmas trees, and that doesn't necessarily have to be by anyone related to the church. If someone wanted to sell Christmas trees on a lot in a residential zoning district that was developed as an institutional group assembly use, whether it be a school, a church, etc., they could make application. And that's a business use that is occupying space on a property that's zoned for an institute or approved for an institutional group assembly use. This is something that is more. The pastor is asking this type of use to be considered as more of an accessory use to the church use itself. He stated that the antique car shows are something that they would do as a church gathering for fundraising and outreach to the community. So it's not really a business venture. It would be doing some fundraising for the church, but not really a business venture as the sale of Christmas trees would be.
Okay. Do you see this application as an application that amends their 03 application to add this, or is it? In other words, if we were inclined to grant them permission for August but not in perpetuity, can they do that under this application? Or is this an application to, do you understand my question?
Yeah. And this is much the same situation as last year. They had requested last year the ability to be able to have multiple events per year, and they were approved last year for just the one event because it was somewhat of an unknown how they would perform with that event. So now, with having, to my knowledge, with the exception of the one complaint, with them having performed in a manner that was not disruptive to the neighborhood, they are back to attempt to be approved for the 3 events per year. Now, the same would hold true this year as what held true last year. Since that would actually be approving less than they're requesting, they can once again be approved for the one-time event. But I think that's even though that would accomplish what Pastor Thornton would need to be accomplished for this summer, I don't think it's necessarily what I think he's looking for the 3 per year.
All right. Mr. Blumley, you provided us with some pictures. Was this a leftover from their antique car show?
I think that is in the within the classics section.
Oh,
Yes.
I didn't know. I thought they
auto
might.
dismantler.
That's why I thought they were junkyard.
Lobby
maybe.
division.
That was in the 1.9 liter classic section.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Pastor Thornton, is there anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
Thank you. I'm Pastor Verlin Thornton from the Restoration Fellowship Church, 675 DeJarnett Lane. I really don't have anything to add to it. Mr. Blomley has done a fine job of presenting our case, and we thank you for the opportunity you gave us last year for this, and we're just wanting to have this opportunity again and be able to do it without having to come back every time that we would like to have an event like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Thornton. Any questions for Pastor Thornton? Okay, then at this time we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
I've got a quick question. If these, for some reason, become burdensome on the surrounding neighborhood, what's the process if it needs to be looked at?
If for some reason they are deemed to be not complying with their special use permit, if staff feels that they are not complying with the intent of the special use permit, that they're having a negative impact, then we would of course first try to work with the applicant in for him to come into compliance. If not, there's always the option of bringing the applicant back for the possible revocation by the board of the special use permit.
Okay. With that, I'll make a motion that the application be approved, subject to staff comments.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? All right, if not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that application has been granted. Pastor Thornton, appreciate you coming in today. Thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to signed variance requests. Application S09049 by Mr. Buddy Follis of Sign Masters for the Pentecostals of Murfreesboro, requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4 24 A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility drainage easement on property located at 1800 Las Casas Pike. The applicant is also requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4 26C282 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which only allows freestanding wall signs within a commercial local zone to be non-illuminated or indirectly illuminated. And Ms. Kerr, I think you're going to review that one for us.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers and members of the board. The applicant, Pentecostal of Murfreesboro, represented by Buddy Follis of Sign Masters, is requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4 26C2A2 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which only allows freestanding wall signs within commercial local zone to be non-illuminated or indirectly illuminated, and also asking for a variance from Section 25 1/4 24A22, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement. Pentecostals of Murfreesboro is requesting a sign variance to be allowed to install a 60-square-foot internally illuminated freestanding wall sign 6 feet overall height within a 15-foot, it overhangs a 15-foot waterline easement and sewer easement and a 25-foot drainage easement on a property located at 1800 New Las Casas Highway. This sign would also be within 200 feet of a residential area And the agreement for assigning a City of Murfreesboro easement has been signed by the Murfreesboro Water and Sewer Department and the city engineer at this time. All other setbacks and regulations will apply, as well as the applicant has agreed to place an automatic timer on the sign for the sign to come on at dusk and go off at 10 p.m. In 1995, the BZA did grant a variance to the Murfreesboro United Pentecostal Church at this location to install a 16-square-foot internally illuminated ground sign with an overall height of 8 foot. At that time, there was no illumination that was allowed at all, and the display area for the sign back then was 40 square feet. And they are requesting the maximum that they can get now, which is a 60 square foot, and that it be internally illuminated. The sign is also, as you all noticed at the ride-around today, is quite a distance from the right-of-way. You've got 20 feet at least from the edge of the pavement to where the sign is located. And the applicant is here, Mr. Buddy Follis, to answer any questions that you all might have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Kerr. Is this one where we need to do this in two separate motions?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yes. All right, any questions for Ms. Kerr? All right, thank you. Mr. Follis, anything you'd like to add to this application?
My name is Buddy Follis. I own Sign Masters, and incidentally, the senior pastor of the church is also here today, Brother Phil DePriest. If you've got any questions of him, he'll be glad to answer those questions. Let me clarify one item that, Amelia, I just discovered this after, as I was sitting here looking at the drawings. We are actually going to ask for a smaller sign than the 60 feet that was shown on the original drawings. The dimensions should have been shown as a 4 foot by 14 foot. I mistakenly included it or showed it as a 4 by 15. So we're actually asking for a 56 square foot sign. It's an unusual piece of property. As you know, there are 2 easements, giving us a total of 40 feet. The sign will basically be installed in the utility easement. We've got the sign designed that where, if in the event that the Murfreesboro Water Department did want to do work in that easement, within 2 hours we could have that sign picked off of the foundation and out of their way. And of course, the owner is prepared to do that in the event this happens. The other thing, again, there's 2 easements. We really believe one of the items that we have to talk about in this is the safety, whether adding this sign will increase or have impact in as far as any safety issues or fire issues. Actually, we think that there might be an improvement. This is a fairly high-speed roadway. The property is approaching a heavily commercialized area. Their driveway is currently very dark. We really believe that this might, by having this as a lighted sign, even though we're setting quite a ways off the road, we might actually improve the safety situation some by putting some ambient light on that entrance, because as a driver is approaching from the city, they're facing a lot of ambient light from the commercial areas down the road. So we think that this would be an improvement in that regard. As far as this condition being general or widespread, actually, when this large campus was first developed, these 2 easements, and I don't know all the history of it, these 2 easements did not exist, but over the years they've been added due to because of drainage situations in the immediate area, not just their campus, but in other areas or all along that roadway. And there was a 10-inch water line added that caused the Murfreesboro Water Department to ask for the utility easement, and the customer did grant that. I don't think there was any purchase involved. I think it was granted. The sign, as mentioned, will be designed so as far as minimizing the impact on the neighboring community. It will have a timer on it that will cut it off if the board approves this application. Will cut it off not later than 10 o'clock. There may be occasions where the owner would want it earlier than that. I'm not sure, but in no event will it stay on after 10 o'clock. The type of lighting we've got in this sign, actually where most of the commercial interior lit signs have illumination of up around 1,200 to 1,400 lumens per square foot. This particular sign will be down in the 900 to 950 lumen per square foot range. So it's not your typical Shell station sign or your crystal sign or anything like that. And I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And like I say, the senior pastor is here if you have any questions of him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Follis. Any questions for Mr. Follis? All right, thank you, sir. At this time, we're going to go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further motions, or any further questions, comments, or motions.
Mr. Chairman, if nobody has any comments, I'll move. I guess we'll take the public utility variance first, and I'll move for approval of that variance.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we'll move then on to the request for the internal illumination portion of this application. Is there a motion on that?
I'll make a motion that we approve the internal illumination, subject to staff comments.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Foss, that application has been granted in its entirety.
Chairman Rogers?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Davis would like a clarification on who seconded that motion, if I could get
I
that.
did.
Ms. Mosby.
Thank you very much.
We're pressing forward without a break. If you does anyone need to take a break? I think we're closing in on the finish line here.
I'm fine, thank you.
All right. All right, then we'll keep moving. Application S09050 by Mr. Buddy Foss of Sign Masters for Auto Art South, requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement on property located at 115 Indian Park Drive. And Ms. Kerr, if you'd review that one for us.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The applicant, Danny Wallace, owner of Auto Art South, represented by Buddy Follis of Sign Masters Company, is requesting a variance from 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement without the consent of the easement holders and the BZA's approval. The sign location proposed is 115 Indian Park Drive and is within a commercial highway zone. The applicant is requesting permission to erect one internally illuminated ground sign with 64 square feet of display area and an overall height of 7 feet. The sign will overhang a 20-foot drainage easement. Agreement for a sign in a City of Murfreesboro easement has been signed by the city engineer and the Director of Building and Codes at this time. The applicant will comply with all other setbacks and regulations. There was one stipulation placed on this from the Urban Environmental that they have to remove a tree to place this sign in this particular location, and they have agreed to replace that tree with another tree on the site somewhere.
All right, thank you, Ms. Kerr.
And the applicant is here to answer any questions that you may have.
All right. Any questions for Ms. Kerr? All right, thank you. Mr. Foss, anything you'd like to add to this application?
No, I think she's explained. We're only overhanging 3 feet.
You're going to overhang only 3 feet? Okay.
And it is a removable sign.
Yes, sir. With sign. All right. If there's no questions in for Mr. Foss, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further questions, comments, or motion.
If there's no comments, Mr. Chairman, I move for approval of the variance.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
This is subject to staff
I'm sorry,
comments.
my motion
Correct.
should be amended to subject to the staff comments.
Any objection to that addition to the motion? Okay,
We're
thank you.
all in favor of that.
Sorry.
All right. Mr. Falls, that application has been granted, subject to staff comments. I think that will finish you off for today. Thanks very much. All right. We'll move next to application S09051 by Mr. Howard Wilson of Blue Sky Construction, requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement on property located at 563 River Rock Boulevard. Ms. Kerr.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The applicant, Blue Sky Construction, represented by President Howard Wilson and Construction Manager Brian Burns, is requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a foundation or sign placed in or over public utility or drainage easements without consent of the easement holder and the BZA's approval. The sign is located at 563 River Rock Boulevard and is within a planned residential zone. The applicant is requesting permission to legally establish 2 externally illuminated freestanding wall signs, each with 5 square feet of display area and an overall height of 7 feet 10 inches within a 10-foot utility easement. Both signs are existing and have already been installed without sign permits or a sign variance. The agreement for a sign in a City of Murfreesboro easement has been signed by the Murfreesboro Water and Sewer Department, the Murfreesboro Electric Department, and the Director of Building and Codes Department. The applicant is in compliance with all other setbacks and regulations, and Mr. Brian Burns is here to answer any questions you may have. I do have a couple of pictures that I want to show you of the site itself where the signs are located. If you queue up there we go. Okay, the signs themselves, this is the right-of-way here. The signs are within this utility easement, but they are out of the right-of-way. The signs themselves are very well designed. Entryway signs that are connected to a fence. With general retreat, sign faces is the only portion of sign area, 5 square feet. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Kerr. Any questions for Ms. Kerr?
I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman. I will state for the record that while I have no direct financial interest in this particular venture, I do have some financial interest with the applicant, and therefore I'll be abstaining from discussion or vote on this application, just based on the appearance of any sort of conflict.
All right. We will note that. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kerr. Is Mr. Burns, I think, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
No, sir.
All right. At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
I'm going to make a motion that we approve the sign variance.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. Mr. Burns, that application has been granted. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate your patience sitting through a long meeting today. All right. On to the final applications, S09052 by Mr. Charles Butler, requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement on property located at the southwest corner of St. Andrews Drive and Bellhaven Drive. The applicant is also requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 26C1D, which states that the size of letters shall not exceed 24 inches in height. And Ms. Kerr.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The applicant, Mr. Charles Butler, developer of Bellhaven Subdivision, is requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits signs placed in or over utility or drainage easements on a sign located in the southwest corner of St. Andrews Drive and Bellhaven Drive. He is also requesting a variance from Section 25¼ 26C 1D, which states that the size of letters shall not exceed 24 inches in height. And I do have a couple of pictures to show of this site. First of all, I want to show the site plan of the location. Oh, that's the wrong one, sorry. This is at the intersection of Bellhaven Drive and St. Andrews Drive. And here's the location of the sign here. As you can see, it's in a common area detention easement as well as a 10-foot utility easement. The sign itself, he is requesting the letters, the height of the letters. They are currently 28 inches in height, and the sign ordinance only allows them to be 24 inches in height. But with BZA approval, he could be granted a 15% variance, which would give him 27.5 inches. The applicant has currently removed this lettering from this sign, pending the decision of the board as to whether he can go with the 24, where he needs to stay at the 24, or can increase it to the 27.5. So the applicant is requesting permission to legally establish one indirectly illuminated freestanding wall sign with 40 square feet of display area and 8 feet in height to be allowed to remain within a 10-foot public utility easement, detention easement, and with letters in a height of more than 24 inches. The current letter size is 28. The applicant by code is allowed 15% and would need to replace letters or reduce the size of the current letters to 27.5. The agreement for a sign in a city easement has been signed by the Murfreesboro Electric Department, the city engineer, and the director of building and codes, as well as a signed agreement for a sign installed in a consolidated utility district of Rutherford County's waterline easement, and will have been made a part of this application. All other regulations and setbacks will apply. The current sign is also located slightly in a right-of-way, and the applicant will appear before the Planning Commission for approval of this sign upon the BZA's variance approvals, and the Planning Commission has the authority to grant approval of a sign in the right-of-way.
All right, thank you, Ms. Kerr. Any questions from Ms. Kerr?
Chairman Rogers, one thing that I'd like to add, because I do handle the staff comments for the development entrance signs that come before the Planning Commission. I know Mr. Halliburton sees a number of these on the consent agenda, and Ms. Kerr stated that the Planning Commission does have the approval to grant, and this is not for a point of information, the ability to grant the location of a sign in the city right-of-way that's the function of the Planning Commission, and if this application is approved by the BZA, then Mr. Butler's next step would be to prepare an application for the Planning Commission for development entrance sign approval. And if the Planning Commission approves the current location, then it would be allowed to be partially located in the right-of-way as it is now. And of course, the sign is existing right now, and it was erected without permits, variance, and without development entrance sign approval.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Butler, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Charlie Butler. I live on 353 Calumet Trace. Since I learned that the letters were not in compliance, I have removed each and every one of them and will replace them, if approved, by 24-inch letters. If you have any questions for me, I'll be happy to answer.
All right, thank you, Mr. Butler. Any questions for Mr. Butler?
So, Mr. Butler, are you not asking for the variance with respects to the 15% increase? Is that
No, I have removed them, as I say, since I learned they were not in compliance, and I will replace them, if approved, by 24-inch letters.
Okay, thank you.
I think what Mr. Halliburton is saying is you have the absolute right to replace them with 24-inch letters. You don't have to be approved for that. Is that fair to say, Mr. Blomley? Yes, sir. So,
And my discussion with Mr. Butler on Monday when he removed those is that he still did want to request the 15% variance, and if he was granted that 15% variance, would go back with 27.5-inch letters. If he was not, he would go back with 24-inch letters. Is that correct, Mr. Butler?
That is correct.
okay.
Okay, I'm lost.
What size do you want
Yeah,
your
what
letter?
size are you asking for? I thought you just said you're going to want to replace it with 24-inch letters, which was the...
If the sign is approved.
Yes, sir. So you're not going to go... You don't want to go back with 27.5-inch letters? Or do you want to go back?
No, I'll go back with 24-inch letters.
Period.
So,
Okay.
Mr. Butler, are you withdrawing the request for the 15% increase?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Butler. Any other questions for Mr. Butler? All right. At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. I need you to state your name and any address and any comments that you might have.
My name is Sherry Scoville. I'm a resident of Bellhaven. I live at 2815 Silver Springs Court. Many of the neighbors do have concerns about the sign as it stands. One of the concerns that we have is the material that the letters are attached to. I'd also like to thank Mr. Butler for going back to 24 inches because that is one of the things that we did want to address. Also, the neighbors, if you could please put the picture up. We do have a concern about one of the areas on the sign. Cue up the picture. Okay. One of the areas that we're concerned about are these sticking straight up in the air. I believe originally those were supposed to have lights attached to them. And many of us are concerned about being ridiculed on a regular basis by anyone that comes into our subdivision by these poles sticking straight up in the air. We understand because there is not a homeowners association yet, because there are not that many homes in the area, that electricity would have to be provided by Mr. Butler. We are not asking that, but we are asking that he put some sort of a light on them, even though they may not have electricity going to them, just for the aesthetic purposes. So that is our concern. And also, we can see that the area has been cleaned and made attractive, and we'd like to ask that it be kept that way on a regular basis, and that mowing be provided for the subdivision on a regular basis, since the hope is that more homes will be sold in that area by builders. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions? All right. Anyone, Mr. Butler, I'm going to come back to you here in just a second. Anyone else present wishing to speak for or against this application?
Hello, my name is Tanyelle Cole. I'm also a resident of Bellhaven at 2706 United Drive. As Sherry stated, my neighbor, we do have concerns with the sign. I personally do not want the letters to be replaced at 24, 27. I would like something similar to Bellhaven or Belle Reve, which is our neighbors. Charlie Butler also did their subdivision. Or Kimbrough Woods, because the letters are just, when they took them down, you could see that they were kind of super glued or hot glued to the sign, and so they kind of stick out, and it does. We've gotten complaints from Kimbrough Woods regarding our sign. My husband was a realtor, and at one point could not sell anything in Kimbrough Woods because of our sign, because of Belhaven's sign. Also, the landscaping. Sorry, nervous too. The landscaping, we would like to be redid also with the sign. It's not well kept. There's weeds that grow there. Just overall, I personally would like an overhaul done on the sign if it's going to be approved. If not, just tore down and just redone completely. So.
All right, thank you, Ms. Cole. Any questions for Ms. Cole? All right, thank you, ma'am. Anyone else present wishing to speak for or against this application? All right, seeing none, then we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed. And I know Ms. Kerr and Mr. Butler, you all both were standing up at one point, maybe wanting to make some additional comments. We'd be glad to take those now.
I just wanted to address the little pole that's sticking up. That is designed to put lights up there if approved. I have already bought the lights. I paid $500 a piece for them, so it would be safer at night and look pretty. And I do pay for the electricity. I do pay for the sign and the upkeep. And if any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer.
When do you plan on putting those in?
When approved. I already have them. They're in my garage. Just waiting for the approval of the sign to have an electrician to put those in.
Real good. All right. Thank you, Mr. Butler.
That is what I was going to let you know. Mr. Butler, that's why we've gotten to this point. He came in to pull an electrical permit to be able to put those fixtures on the lights and hook it to electric, and he can't get an electrical permit without a sign permit. So that's why we're here today, so he can get, if he can get approval for the signage, then he can pull his electrical permit to put those fixtures on.
All right. I also should point out that we, as the Board of Zoning Appeals, don't have the ability to control how well that sign is maintained. That's completely up to the developer. All we're being asked to do today is approve whether it can be placed in or over this public utility or drainage easement. So our scope of what we're asked to do here today is very limited. And as far as the size of the letters are concerned, as you maybe could tell from our discussion earlier, Mr. Butler has an absolute right to put up anything 24 inches and under, and that's what he's asked to do. So he's actually withdrawn that portion of the application that was seeking to put up letters that are anything larger than that. So I wanted to address some of those concerns that you all expressed during your comments. Okay, are there any other discussions, comments, questions, or a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we approve the variance request, subject to any staff comments.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Butler, that application has been granted as it concerns the placement of the sign in or over the public utility or drainage easement. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you coming in today, as well as those residents that spoke to. All right, next item on the agenda, staff reports and other business.
Only one item today, Chairman Rogers, just to update the board on the fireworks selling season. All of the tents went up and were approved, and all of them had cleaned up in a timely fashion and have received their approval. If they haven't received their deposits back, they have been approved to get their $500 deposits back. So the cleanup inspections went well. Just wanted to let the board know that.
All right. All right. Thank you, Mr. Baum. Any other questions? If not, we are adjourned.